There is an aircraft program that does not exist on any public budget sheet. It does not appear in any congressional hearing transcript that you are allowed to read. It was never announced at a Pentagon press briefing. No president ever stood at a podium and mentioned its name. No defense secretary ever described its mission in open session. And yet, over the last 4 decades, somewhere between $400 billion and $500 billion of American taxpayer money quietly disappeared into it. Not stolen, not mismanaged. Spent, deliberately, methodically, and in total secrecy. On aircraft, on technology, on capabilities so advanced that the people who built them are still not allowed to talk about what they made. And what makes this story truly extraordinary is not the price tag, though $500 billion is a number that should stop you cold. What makes it extraordinary is that it worked. The secrecy held, the program produced real aircraft that actually fly, that have actually flown over real battlefields, that have already changed the nature of air power in ways the rest of the world is only beginning to understand, and most people on Earth have no idea any of it happened. Today we are going inside the black world, the classified side of American aviation that operates completely outside the normal defense budget. We are talking about the programs, the aircraft, the facilities, and the decisions that have consumed $500 billion in secret. We are talking about the men and women who built these machines and were never allowed to tell their families what they actually did for a living. We are talking about a level of government capability that most Americans have never been asked to consider. And by the time this is over, the way you look at the sky above you is going to change permanently. If you have ever looked up at a strange light moving in ways that did not make sense and wondered what you were actually seeing, type Black World in the comments right now. Because today, we are going to answer that question. Before we go any further, take 5 seconds and subscribe. The overwhelming majority of people watching this video right now are not subscribed. It costs you nothing. It takes 1 tap, and it means you never miss a story like this one. Now let us start at the beginning, because to understand the $500 billion secret, you need to understand how the black world was born in the first place. The story starts in the early 1950s. The Cold War has just begun in earnest. The Soviet Union has tested its first nuclear weapon. American military planners are suddenly confronted with a terrifying reality. They do not know what is happening inside Soviet territory. They do not know how many nuclear weapons the Soviets have built. They do not know where those weapons are positioned. They do not know the strength of Soviet air defenses, the location of their military bases, or the readiness of their forces. And without that information, the entire strategic posture of the United States is built on guesswork. President Eisenhower understood this problem with unusual clarity. He had commanded the largest military operation in human history during World War II. He understood intelligence. He understood the cost of not knowing, and he understood that getting spies into the Soviet Union on the ground was nearly impossible. So he asked a different question. What if you could look down at the Soviet Union from so high in the sky that their air defenses simply could not reach you? That question launched a program, and that program, the development and production of the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, became the foundation of everything that followed. The U-2 was built not by the Air Force in the normal acquisition system. It was built in secret by a small team of engineers at a facility in Burbank, California, under a man named Kelly Johnson, at a division of Lockheed that would eventually become one of the most significant institutions in the history of aviation. They called it the Skunk Works, and the way they worked was deliberately structurally different from anything else in the American defense establishment. Small teams, tight security, flat management, direct access between the chief engineer and the customer, minimal bureaucracy, maximum speed. The U-2 went from a drawing on a piece of paper to a flying aircraft in 8 months. 8 months. For context, a modern fighter aircraft program in the normal defense acquisition system takes decades from initial concept to operational deployment. The Skunk Works did it in 8 months, and they kept it completely secret. That success established a model. The CIA, and later the Air Force, learned something fundamental from the U-2 program. When you remove a project from the normal budget process, when you wall it off from congressional oversight, when you give a small elite team direct resources and direct authority, you get results that the normal system simply cannot match. And so the Black World was born, not as a conspiracy, not as a hidden agenda, but as a practical solution to a real problem. You needed to develop capabilities so advanced, so sensitive, that the very existence of the program needed to be protected. And the only way to protect it was to hide it entirely. What followed the U-2 was a succession of programs that pushed the boundaries of what human beings understood to be physically possible in aviation, each one more advanced than the last, each one more expensive, each one more completely hidden. The A-12 Oxcart came next, also built by the Skunk Works, also funded through channels that did not appear in any public document. The A-12 flew at speeds exceeding Mach 3.2, more than 3 times the speed of sound. It flew at altitudes above 85,000 feet. It was made of titanium because aluminum could not withstand the heat generated by sustained flight at those speeds. And here is the detail that captures the absurdity of what was being achieved. The engineers building the A-12 faced a problem nobody had ever faced before. At Mach 3, the friction of the air against the aircraft's skin generates temperatures high enough to destroy conventional aluminum structures. The entire airframe had to be rethought, and when they looked for the one material that could handle the heat and still be light enough to fly, they found titanium. But there was only one place on Earth that produced titanium in the quantities they needed: the Soviet Union. The CIA quietly ran a series of front companies to purchase Soviet titanium, which was then used to build an aircraft whose entire purpose was to spy on the Soviet Union. The Soviets sold the Americans the material that was used to photograph their own military installations. That is the level of operational complexity, of layered deception, that the black world operated at from its very beginning. The SR-71 Blackbird followed. And the SR-71 is where the story begins to touch the numbers that will eventually add up to $500 billion. The SR-71 was the successor to the A-12. It flew faster. It flew higher. It carried more sensors. It was the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built by human hands, and it remained classified for years after it began operational service. The men who flew it could not tell their wives where they were going when they left for work. The wives who lived on the bases where the SR-71 operated knew something extraordinary was happening because they could hear it, that enormous sonic thunderclap of an aircraft accelerating past Mach 3 overhead. But they were not allowed to ask, and their husbands were not allowed to answer. That culture, that complete separation between the work and the rest of the world, defines what the black world is and what it costs in human terms, not just financial ones. Now we need to talk about money, because the numbers here are genuinely staggering, and most people have never been given a clear picture of how they accumulate. The United States federal budget includes what is known as the black budget. This is the portion of the defense and intelligence budget that is classified. The overall number, the total amount requested for classified programs, is disclosed each year. As of recent years, that number is roughly $80 to $90 billion annually. That is the total classified budget across all agencies and programs. But inside that number is a subset that is specifically dedicated to what the intelligence community calls Special Access Programs, or SAPs. These are programs so sensitive that knowing the program exists is itself classified. Not just the technical details, the existence. And within SAPs, there is a further subset called waived SAPs, or black programs in the truest sense. These are programs that are specifically exempted from the normal congressional notification requirements. By law, the executive branch is required to notify the relevant congressional committees when major defense programs are initiated. Waived SAPs are exempted from that requirement by statute. The program begins, the money flows, and the relevant oversight committees may or may not be informed, depending on a determination made entirely within the executive branch. This is not a loophole. It is a deliberate legal structure put in place precisely because some capabilities are too sensitive to risk in the normal political process. But what it means in practice is that hundreds of billions of dollars can flow through the defense budget without the people whose job it is to oversee that budget ever knowing exactly where it went. And over 4 decades of sustained black aviation programs, that is exactly what happened. The estimates that researchers, journalists, and former government officials have assembled over years of investigation point to a cumulative total somewhere between $400 and $500 billion spent on classified aviation programs since the late 1970s. That is not $400 billion on one aircraft. That is $400 billion across a series of programs, some of which produced operational aircraft that are still flying today, some of which produced technology demonstrators that never entered service, some of which explored concepts so advanced that they ultimately proved ahead of what the manufacturing base could support, and some of which, if the evidence that has accumulated over decades is taken seriously, produced aircraft so capable that their existence still cannot be publicly confirmed. Let us talk about what we know produced and what we believe produced, because this is where the story moves from financial history into something that feels, to many people, genuinely difficult to believe. The first major confirmed product of the sustained black aviation investment was the F-117 Nighthawk, the stealth fighter, and the F-117 story is the perfect case study in how the black world actually operates, from first concept to first public flight. In the early 1970s, a team of engineers at Lockheed, working from theoretical work originally done by a Soviet mathematician named Pyotr Ufimtsev, developed a method to calculate the radar cross-section of an aircraft based entirely on its geometry. The insight was profound. Radar works by bouncing electromagnetic waves off a surface and detecting the return signal. The strength of that return signal, the radar cross-section, is determined largely by the shape of the surface, not its size. A large aircraft with the right geometry can return a smaller radar signal than a small bird. The Lockheed team built a computer program they called Echo 1, and they used it to design an aircraft so geometrically optimized against radar detection that it would be essentially invisible to the air defense systems of the time. The resulting shape was deeply strange. Flat, angular, faceted surfaces that looked nothing like any conventional aircraft. The aerodynamics of the design were so inherently unstable that no human pilot could fly the aircraft without a computer actively correcting the flight path thousands of times per second. The fly-by-wire flight control system that made the F-117 flyable was itself a technological achievement as significant as the stealth geometry. This aircraft was designed, built, and flown in complete secrecy for 8 years before the public was ever told it existed. The program was called Have Blue in its demonstrator phase and Senior Trend when it moved to full production. The aircraft first flew in 1977. It entered operational service in 1983. It flew combat missions in Panama in 1989, and the American public did not know it existed until November 1988, when the Air Force, under pressure from reports and photographs that were beginning to emerge, released a single grainy photograph and confirmed that a stealth aircraft existed. Even then, the full technical details remained classified. The aircraft that had been flying combat-ready missions for 5 years was introduced to the American public as though it had just been invented. That gap, between what the black world had already achieved and what the public was told existed, is the central reality of this entire story. The total investment in the F-117 program, including development, production, and operational costs, is estimated at between $6 and $7 billion in the dollars of the time. Adjusted for today's purchasing power, that number is significantly larger. But the F-117 was just the beginning of what the stealth investment would eventually produce. Because even as the F-117 was entering operational service, the black world was already funding the next generation. Northrop Grumman was working on a program so ambitious, so different in its fundamental approach, that even describing it to people with security clearances required careful management of what each person was allowed to know. That program was the B-2 Spirit. The B-2 is a flying wing, no fuselage, no tail, a pure wing shape that generates lift across its entire surface. The design eliminates many of the sharp angles and corner reflectors that produce large radar returns in conventional aircraft. Combined with radar-absorbing materials and carefully managed engine inlet and exhaust geometries, the B-2 achieves a radar cross-section comparable to a large bird. An aircraft with a wingspan of 172 feet is difficult to detect at operationally meaningful ranges. The B-2 program is, in raw financial terms, the most expensive aircraft procurement program in American history. The original planned buy was 132 aircraft. As the Cold War ended, that number was slashed first to 75 and then ultimately to 21 aircraft. The cost that had been spread across 132 aircraft was now spread across 21. The resulting per-unit cost is staggering. Each B-2 Spirit cost approximately $2.1 billion. That is the flyaway cost of a single aircraft. When you add the research and development costs, the infrastructure, the support systems, and the operational expenses, the program total exceeded $44 billion for 21 aircraft. The B-2 program alone accounts for a meaningful fraction of the $500 billion total we are discussing today, and it was only possible because the foundational work done in the black world over the previous decade had established both the technology and the institutional infrastructure to execute it. But here is where the story takes a turn that most people are completely unprepared for. Because the F-117 and the B-2 are known programs, they are declassified, They are on public display. You can go to museums and walk around them. They represent the layer of the black world that has been released into public knowledge. What the evidence strongly suggests is that beneath that layer, there are more programs. Programs that have not been released. Programs whose aircraft are still flying, still operating, still classified. And the investment in those programs may dwarf everything we have already discussed. The evidence for what researchers call the Black Triangle programs begins accumulating in the late 1980s and accelerates dramatically through the 1990s. Across a wide geographic area centered roughly on the western United States, people begin reporting sightings of aircraft that match no known design. Not the angular facets of the F-117, not the smooth wing shape of the B-2. Something different, large, triangular, often described as having 3 lights at the corners and 1 in the center. Moving at speeds and altitudes inconsistent with civilian aviation, silent in some accounts. Accompanied by a deep subsonic pulse in others, the reports come from too many people, in too many locations, with too many consistent details to dismiss as simple misidentification. Former Air Force officers report seeing these aircraft near known classified test facilities. Ground radar operators at civilian airports report contacts that appear and disappear in ways inconsistent with conventional aircraft. And a former Lockheed Skunk Works engineer named Ben Rich, who succeeded Kelly Johnson as head of the Skunk Works and oversaw the development of the F-117, makes statements before his death in 1995 that have been studied and debated ever since. Rich tells multiple people, in multiple settings, that the technology to take extraterrestrial entities home exists, that there is an error in the equations that can be corrected, and that if you can dream it, you can do it. He is asked directly, in at least one recorded account, whether the United States has the ability to travel to the stars. And his answer, parsed carefully, suggests he is not speaking purely hypothetically. Now, Rich's statements have been interpreted in very different ways by different researchers. Some see them as confirmation of exotic propulsion technology developed in the black world. Others see them as the philosophical musing of an elderly engineer who spent his life pushing the limits of what was possible. But what Rich confirms directly, in statements that are not ambiguous, is that the Skunk Works, during his tenure and before it, developed and flew aircraft that the public had no knowledge of. He confirms the existence of programs beyond the F-117. He confirms that capabilities were developed that were not announced. He is describing, in the careful language of a man who still respects his security clearances, even in his final years, the black world that we are talking about today. The program that most researchers believe represents the next layer of classified aviation investment is known by various designations depending on the source. Aurora is the name most commonly associated with it in open literature, though that name itself may be a deliberate misdirection. The theory is that Aurora, or whatever the actual program designation is, represents an American hypersonic reconnaissance aircraft developed in the 1980s to replace the capabilities of the SR-71, which was retired from active service in 1990. The retirement of the SR-71 has always struck aviation researchers as peculiar. Here is the fastest, highest-flying reconnaissance aircraft ever built, a machine that remained unmatched in performance for the entire quarter-century of its operational service, and the Air Force chose to retire it. The official justification was cost. The SR-71 was expensive to operate, requiring specialized fuel, specialized ground support, specialized pilot training. But the timing of the retirement is suggestive. You retire your best reconnaissance platform when you have something better. And if that something better is classified at a level that cannot be publicly acknowledged, the retirement of its predecessor might look exactly like what the SR-71 retirement looked like. Several specific incidents support the hypothesis that something is operating in the atmosphere at speeds and altitudes well beyond what any publicly known aircraft can achieve. In 1991, the Los Angeles Times reported that residents across a large area of Southern California had heard a thunderous roaring sound traveling northwest, leaving a distinctive contrail that witnesses described as a series of donuts on a rope, a pattern consistent with the exhaust plume of a pulse detonation engine, a propulsion concept that was being actively researched in classified programs at precisely that time. Aviation Week in Space Technology, the publication most closely connected to the defense aerospace industry and most respected by the professionals within it, ran multiple reports throughout the early 1990s, citing sources who described a Mach 5+ reconnaissance aircraft operating from classified facilities. The magazine's reporters and editors do not make things up. Their sources are real, their information is checked, and their willingness to stake their professional reputations on these reports suggests they believe the underlying story was credible. The cost of a program like this, a hypersonic aircraft developed over a decade using advanced materials science, exotic propulsion concepts, and the full resources of the American Aerospace Industrial Base operating in a classified environment, would be staggering. Conservative estimates from defense budget analysts who have tracked the unexplained spending in the black budget place the investment in advanced propulsion and aeronautics research at levels that far exceed what the known programs can account for. When you subtract the known costs of the F-117 program, the B-2 program, the various UAV programs that have been declassified in recent years, and the known satellite programs, you are still left with an enormous residual, a pool of spending that went somewhere, that built something, that produced capabilities that have not been publicly acknowledged. The $500 billion figure is not invented. It is the result of decades of careful analysis by people who understand defense budgeting and who looked at the numbers and found that they simply did not add up when only the known programs were accounted for. Something very large, very expensive, and very important was happening in the black world. And the question of exactly what that something was is one of the most significant unanswered questions in the modern history of American national security. Let us talk about the facilities. Because the infrastructure of the black world is in some ways as significant as the aircraft themselves. You cannot build aircraft that do not officially exist in facilities that appear on public maps. You cannot test aircraft that fly at Mach 5 in airspace that is shared with civilian traffic. You need space. You need isolation. You need the ability to control who sees what and when. And the United States has invested heavily in exactly that kind of infrastructure. The most famous classified aviation test facility in the world is Groom Lake, Nevada. Most people know it by its popular name, Area 51. And the popular culture surrounding it has done something fascinating and perhaps deliberate. It has turned a real, active, operational classified flight test facility into a punchline, into a subject of ridicule and entertainment, into something that serious people are not supposed to take seriously. But here is what Groom Lake actually is. It is a facility located within the Nevada Test and Training Range, a restricted airspace area so large that it makes up a significant fraction of the entire state of Nevada. The base itself has a runway that is among the longest in the world, capable of handling any aircraft that exists or might be imagined. The facility has been continuously expanded and upgraded since its establishment in the 1950s to support the U-2 program. Satellite imagery from commercial providers shows construction activity that has been ongoing for decades. New hangars, new support structures, new infrastructure of a kind that makes sense for an organization managing highly complex aircraft programs. The airspace around Groom Lake is restricted to an altitude of unlimited. That means that no civilian or military aircraft not specifically cleared for that airspace is permitted to enter it at any altitude. There are no ceilings. There is no altitude at which normal aircraft operations are permitted. Because if something is operating at 100,000 feet above that facility, it cannot be visible to anyone without a clearance. The facility has its own airline service. Unmarked aircraft, popularly known as Janet flights, carry employees from Las Vegas to the facility on a daily schedule. The employees who work there are required to cover the windows during approach and landing, so they cannot observe the surface features of the facility. They are subject to security agreements that prohibit them from describing anything they observe. They are subject to polygraph testing on a regular basis. This is not the operational profile of a facility that exists to test the next version of a known aircraft. This is the operational profile of a facility that exists to develop and test things that cannot be acknowledged to exist. Beyond Groom Lake, there are other facilities. Plant 42 in Palmdale, California, is the Northrop Grumman production facility where the B-2 was built and where classified work continues. The Helendale facility in the Mojave Desert, operated by Lockheed, was a radar cross-section measurement range used during the development of stealth aircraft. Edwards Air Force Base maintains classified test areas and classified hangar facilities that are not accessible to the majority of the base's personnel. And there are facilities that are not publicly known by name or location, identified only by the testimony of people who worked in them under agreements they believed, with good reason, were legally binding for life. The people who work in these facilities are worth understanding. Because this is perhaps the most humanly remarkable aspect of the entire Black World story. These are not people who signed up to keep secrets. They are engineers, pilots, technicians, Scientists. People who went to university and studied physics and aerodynamics and materials science because they loved the work. And then one day they were approached quietly by a person they trusted, who asked if they would be interested in working on something extraordinary, something they could not discuss, something that would require them to compartmentalize their professional lives from every other aspect of their existence. The people who said yes gave up something profound. They gave up the ability to tell their parents what they built. They gave up the ability to explain to their spouses why they sometimes disappeared for weeks at a time and came home unable to explain where they had been. They gave up the professional recognition that comes from publishing papers, from presenting at conferences, from building a public reputation based on actual accomplishments. A Skunk Works engineer who spent 20 years developing the most advanced aircraft propulsion system in human history cannot tell anyone that they did it. They cannot put it on a resume. They cannot describe it to their children. They took their work to their graves in many cases. The cumulative human cost of the black world, measured in relationships strained and stories never told and achievements never celebrated, is genuinely incalculable. And yet they kept going, because the work itself was extraordinary. Because being part of something that pushed the absolute limit of human capability was worth the price of silence for many of them. Because they believed, and the evidence suggests they were right to believe, that what they were building mattered, that the capabilities they developed gave their country an edge that could not be matched, that the secrecy that surrounded their work was the very thing that made it effective. An adversary who does not know a capability exists cannot build a countermeasure. An adversary who does not know an aircraft can fly at a certain speed, and altitude cannot position defenses against it. The secrecy was not incidental to the mission. It was integral to it. Now let us talk about the aircraft that researchers and analysts believe represent the current state of what the black world has produced. Because the investment did not stop with the F-117 and the B-2. It continued through the 1990s. It continued through the 2000s. It continues today, and what it has produced, if the cumulative evidence assembled over decades by serious researchers is taken at face value, is a generation of aircraft capabilities that the publicly known inventory does not begin to reflect. The RQ-180 is a program that has been partially acknowledged. It is a large unmanned reconnaissance aircraft built by Northrop Grumman, designed specifically to operate in contested airspace where the Global Hawk and other known reconnaissance platforms cannot safely operate. It incorporates advanced stealth characteristics. Its range and endurance are classified. Its operational deployment is classified. The fact that it exists was acknowledged only because commercial satellite imagery of classified facilities showed an aircraft that did not match anything in the known inventory, and the acknowledgement became necessary. Before that imagery emerged, the RQ-180 was a fully black program. A program consuming real money, real resources, real engineering talent, and producing a real operational aircraft that the public was not supposed to know about. The RQ-180 is almost certainly not the most advanced unmanned platform in the current black inventory. It is simply one that has been partially surfaced by circumstance. The programs that have not been surfaced, that remain fully black, that are operating today without any public acknowledgement, represent the current leading edge of what the $500 billion investment has built. The SR-72 is a program that Lockheed Martin has partially discussed in public, which makes it unusual by the standards we have been discussing. The company has described it as a hypersonic successor to the SR-71, capable of Mach 6 flight, and has indicated that technology demonstrator flights have been conducted. The partial public acknowledgement of the SR-72 follows a pattern that has been observed repeatedly in the history of black programs. Before a new capability is fully deployed operationally, before it reaches the point where accidental observation by adversary intelligence becomes a significant operational risk, the program transitions from fully black to what is sometimes called gray, a state of partial acknowledgement that allows the capability to be integrated into the broader force structure without the full secrecy that characterized its development. The SR-72 being discussed publicly today may represent a capability that has been in development and possibly in flight testing for a decade or more. What is being released to the public is the news that it exists. The actual performance characteristics, the actual deployment status, the actual operational capabilities, those remain classified. And then there are the programs that have not made the transition from black to gray, the programs whose existence is suggested by spending patterns, by facility expansions, by the accumulation of witness accounts and radar data and physical evidence, but which remain fully unacknowledged. Aviation Week reported in 2013 that an aircraft described as having a tailless diamond planform had been observed near classified facilities and near Edwards Air Force Base on multiple occasions. The description matched no publicly known aircraft design. The planform, a flat diamond shape, is consistent with stealth design principles and is consistent with theoretical work that had been published in open literature regarding optimal shapes for hypersonic vehicles. Who built it? What it does? How fast it flies? How high? Nobody on the public record is saying, but the money to build it is in the budget. Has been in the budget for years, tens of billions of dollars accumulating quietly in line items that read simply as classified programs or advanced concepts research. The question that all of this raises, the question that gets to the heart of why this story matters beyond simple fascination with secret aircraft, is a question about the relationship between democracy and national security. The United States is a democratic republic. The fundamental principle of that system is that the government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. The governed, the citizens, consent through the mechanism of elected representatives who oversee government activities on their behalf. The black world operates in deliberate tension with that principle. The people authorizing and spending hundreds of billions of dollars are not fully accountable to the representatives of the people whose money is being spent. The oversight that exists is intentionally limited. The information that flows to even cleared congressional overseers is carefully managed. The determination of what is too sensitive to share, even with cleared members of the relevant committees, is made by the executive branch itself. This is not a new tension. It has existed since the U-2 program. Eisenhower himself understood and accepted it, because he believed, with good reason, that the alternative, full public transparency about the most sensitive intelligence-gathering capabilities of the United States, would rapidly eliminate those capabilities. An adversary who knows exactly what you can do, knows exactly what to hide, and exactly how to hide it. The secrecy is the capability, in a very real sense. But the tension has grown as the programs have grown. As the investment has grown from hundreds of millions to tens of billions to hundreds of billions of dollars, the question of whether adequate oversight exists, whether the mechanisms for accountability are functioning as intended, whether the secrecy that protects genuine national security capabilities has in some cases expanded beyond what genuine security requires, these questions have become more urgent. Former senior officials from the intelligence community, including people who ran programs within the black world, have said publicly in retirement that the classification system has been stretched beyond its legitimate purpose. That programs have been classified not because their disclosure would damage national security, but because their disclosure would be embarrassing or politically inconvenient. That the culture of secrecy, once established and institutionalized, tends to expand beyond its original justification. This is a genuinely difficult problem, because the same culture of secrecy that may have grown beyond its legitimate purpose is also the culture that produced real capabilities that have provided real strategic advantages. You cannot simply turn it off. You cannot suddenly open all the books without potentially destroying the very thing that makes the system valuable. And so the tension persists, the money flows, the programs continue, and the gap between what exists in the black world and what the public is told exists grows wider with each passing year and each passing generation of technology. What we can say with confidence, drawing on the accumulated record of history, on the pattern of program revelations, on the testimony of people who worked within these programs, on the careful analysis of researchers who have devoted careers to understanding the black budget, is this. The United States government has spent somewhere in the range of $400 to $500 billion in cumulative terms across 4 decades on classified aviation programs that have not been publicly announced. Some of what that money built has been acknowledged: the U-2, the SR-71, the A-12, the F-117, the B-2, the RQ-170 Sentinel, partially the RQ-180. Some of what that money built has been partially acknowledged in the manner of the SR-72. And some of what that money built remains completely, totally, and perhaps permanently secret. Aircraft that are flying today, that have been flying for years, that have operational missions and operational crews and operational support structures that exist in the United States military inventory in a category that the public inventory does not reflect. The budget documents that can be obtained show spending that cannot be accounted for by the known programs. The facility expansions that can be observed through commercial satellite imagery reflect a level of activity inconsistent with a black world that has stopped producing new capabilities. The pattern of partial acknowledgements, the RQ-170 revealed by its own crash in Iran, the RQ-180 revealed by commercial imagery, suggests a much larger population of programs that have not yet been revealed by circumstance. History says with overwhelming consistency that what the black world is building today, the public will learn about in 15 or 20 years. That the gap between current reality and public knowledge is roughly that wide. And given the pace of technological development in the areas of hypersonics, of directed energy, of autonomous systems, of advanced materials and propulsion, the gap between what exists in the classified world and what the public knows about may be wider today than it has ever been at any point in the history of the program. The $500 billion price tag is the number that anchors all of this in the realm of things that are real and serious and consequential. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a budgetary fact embedded in decades of documented government spending. This is engineering achievement on a scale that rivals the Manhattan Project and the Apollo program. This is institutional commitment to a particular theory of how national security works, a theory built on the conviction that the ability to surprise, the ability to act from a position of capability that an adversary does not know you possess, is among the most valuable strategic assets a nation can hold. Whether you believe that theory is correct, whether you think the level of secrecy involved is appropriate in a democratic society, whether you find the achievements described here inspiring or troubling or both, the fact of what has been built cannot be dismissed. The money is real. The aircraft are real. The capabilities are real. They exist. They fly. They have flown over battlefields. They have gathered intelligence that has shaped American foreign policy and military strategy for decades. They were built by real people who gave up real things to build them. And they were paid for by every American who has ever filed a tax return, whether those Americans knew it or not. The next time you look up at the sky and see something that does not quite make sense to you, something that moves too fast, or too quietly, or at an angle that does not fit anything you recognize, consider this. The black world has been ahead of public knowledge by 15 to 20 years at every point in its history. The U-2 flew for years before anyone admitted it existed. The F-117 flew combat missions before anyone admitted it existed. Whatever is flying today in that classified airspace, over those restricted ranges, out of those unmarked hangars, is real, it is operating, and the $500 billion that built it is the most expensive secret in the history of American aviation. Maybe the most expensive secret in the history of this country, and you were never supposed to know it existed at all. The question now is what else is up there that we have not been told about yet? That answer, history suggests with absolute consistency, is coming. We just do not know when. If this story changed how you think about what is flying above you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are not subscribed yet, do it right now. Stories like this one take real work to put together. Hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and we will see you in the next one.